Share this with whomever has announcements at the 10 o'clock hour. It's been suggested that we do a card shower for Etta Ritchie. Her birthday is October 23rd. We'll put the address up on the board out in the foyer, and the announcement will be made at the 10 o'clock hour. Who's doing that? Are you, Kurt? Or? Joe is. Joe, would you see me and get this? And then when you're done with it, would you give it to Tracy? Thank you, sir. Good to see all of you this morning. At Marietta Memorial at this moment, as far as I know, Susan Strauss's mother got home this past Tuesday, fell, and ended up with a fracture in her neck. Fortunately, no paralysis. And they're debating whether she will go to Selby for rehab, remain at Memorial, go to a facility. So we'll try to keep you updated about that. And also Ruth Hughes, Linda's mother, was in Selby with a light stroke. Now, those of you who don't know Ruth, she and Linda typically sat in Center Church, the very back row. And Linda is one of our ladies who sends cards to everybody. I get the question frequently, who is Linda Hughes? And Linda is Ruth's daughter. Ruth is 90 or close to it, and probably will be at some nursing facility for 20 days of rehab or so, but keep her in your prayers. And Joe, I didn't read the announcement sheet. I hope that's on there, but if it's not, you can add it. That's why I do this at this hour. That and the fact that David is going to have our prayer. David Carroll, he is easily heard, and we will pray together at this time. Thank you, David. As you know, we're looking at world geography and ancient biblical history and trying to tie events in Scripture with the geography that is in the news so much today. And I wanted to begin this particular session with a very quick overview of the importance of a study like this. Winston Churchill made this statement: the farther back you can look, the farther ahead you are likely to see. And I know there are people who find history extremely dull and really don't enjoy the study of it, but it can be extremely enlightening. George Santayana observed, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." When you look at events as they play out in history, you ought to learn valuable lessons that prevent making the same mistakes down the road. Sadly, that generally doesn't happen. Alan Webster wrote, and this is a quotation from a recent spiritual sword I just thought was interesting: "Historians can tell us what happened. Newspapers can tell us what is happening. But the Bible tells us why it's happening." And so many of the things that are playing out right now in current events really do have their origins way back in ancient history. It's important to note that the average lifespan of an empire is approximately 200 years. Now, from the biblical perspective, the empires that we consider are as follows. In the Old Testament, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. The intertestamental period following the Persians would be Alexander the Great, and in the New Testament, the Romans. Of course, there is a very brief time when Israel dominated during the days of David and Solomon, approximately 80 years. That nation was the dominant power in the Middle East, but it was very short-lived. You look at these stories, the narratives of each of these empires, and you do discover that 200 is about the average lifespan. I want to give you some information from a book entitled The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival by John Glubb. And he offers, and this is just preparatory to our beginning to look at Egypt this morning and what follows in connection with Israel. Here's the life cycle of nations as Glubb records it. We begin with the age of outburst, where explorers are the heroes. We would say in our own nation's history, pioneers lead the way. I immediately thought of some of our early pioneers and some of the explorers that set out to discover this vast land. And what a challenge that must have been. I don't like, frankly, to go places where I don't have any idea what to expect. I do it, but it's a little uneasy. I can't imagine Lewis and Clark setting out as they did, for instance. All new territory from the perspective of Caucasians. Of course, Native Americans, inhabited that land, but for them it was brand new territory. What a challenge and what courage that would have taken. The age of conquest follows, and soldiers become the heroes. George Washington, our first president, of course, was commander of the Revolutionary Army and made a tremendous name for himself. His background was in the British military. And it's hard to find anyone today that doesn't respect what he did. Now, I know that's not always true. Columbus gets a really bad rap these days, if you haven't noticed that. But fortunately, Washington is still highly respected. I was trying to think of other soldier heroes, and it came to my mind men like George Patton, and I just went blank with the fellow who promised the Philippines that he would come back, Douglas MacArthur. We probably would not have the situation on the Korean Peninsula we have today if our leaders had listened to Doug MacArthur. But you look at those names, you recognize their contribution to the history of this nation. Every nation has them. There's the age of commerce where entrepreneurs are our heroes. And immediately, if you know our history, you think of folks like Edison, Ford, Carnegie and Steele, things of that nature. Then you go to the age of affluence. The rich are our heroes. The empire switches from offensive to defensive. It stops taking territory and starts building walls. And you think of, and I'm trying to relate this to obviously our own nation. Today you would think of men like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett. If you go back a ways, you probably would think of the Mellons, Samuel Chase, and others. These are the folks who have the big bucks. Then you go to the age of intellect, and I think this is really important to note. Intellectuals are heroes, and a nation's intellectual institutions or educational institutions often produce skeptics who oppose the values and religious beliefs of early leaders. That leads us to finding in our own Constitution what the original framers never envisioned: the right to marry whomever, men marrying men and women marrying women. That is as far from constitutional as it can be, but in a culture where the values of the past have been rejected, this is the kind of thing that happens. You get abortion on demand, but you go back to our original framers and you will be hard-pressed to find any of them that did not have a really devout conviction that life was precious and sacred. They could not have envisioned in the Constitution a time when we would so casually and with such a cavalier attitude destroy the lives of the unborn in their mother's wombs. And we're reaping the fruits of this even as I speak. And then there's the age of decadence. Interestingly, if you read Deuteronomy 8:11 through 20 and 31:20, you get a good idea or good feel for the warning that God gave to Israel about this very thing. With abundance, with great prosperity, cultures tend to collapse. They lose sight of their values, their focus is misplaced, and that leads to the age of decline and ultimate collapse. And there are no heroes. I will simply say from my perspective that we're nearing the final stage. I don't think it's hopeless. I really believe we can learn from the past and correct the mistakes, but it has to happen, and it needs to happen far more quickly than apparently it is, if it's happening at all. But I thought this was an excellent way to begin today's study, because it fascinates me that you can look at history and you really, if you're careful, really see this playing out in nearly every nation in history as it has risen and fallen. Now to our study this morning, Egypt and the birth of Israel. We're looking at modern geography and ancient history. And when we do that, the best place to begin in the sense of our study today is with Egypt, because this is really the first nation where Abraham has contact. And out of this nation, the nation of Israel will arise. And so it's important to see how it plays out in biblical history, and then to make some observations relative to modern time. Today, Egypt is primarily a Muslim state. Up until the 7th century BC, it was primarily, in the broadest sense of the definition, a Christian state. But with the advent of Islam in Saudi Arabia, which is the neighbor due east of Egypt, with the spread of Islam, a transition occurred. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that transition as I speak to you this morning. When you look at Egypt, you see a number of things on the map. You see the Sinai Peninsula, where the Israelites wandered for 40 years. That would be the region right there. This is the Red Sea, and of course the Gulf of Suez, the Suez Canal. This is the Nile River. All of that should be fairly self-explanatory. But in relationship to Egypt, Israel ultimately settled here in the Nile Delta and the land of Goshen, and it's there in Egypt that they went from some 75 souls to a people numbering, the estimates are anywhere from 1.5 million to 3 million people. That occurred over 400 years, and at the close of 4 centuries, God raised up Moses to lead his people out of bondage and to the land that had been promised to Abraham more than 400 years earlier. That's the region right here. And as you know, Israel is not terribly large geographically. Today, it is a land about 1/3 the size of the state of Ohio. So geographically, it's not large, but it looms large in so much of what goes on in the world today. Egypt and the Old Testament begins with Abraham's call and his journey. He is called by God to be the father of a great nation through which all nations would be blessed. And we learned that he was never actually located in any one place for long. He lived a nomadic life, and one of his first encounters leaving Ur of the Chaldees over in the region that is modern Iraq today, he traveled 600 miles northwest to Haran, also in modern Iraq, remained there till the death of his father Terah, and then began his migration south into Palestine, ultimately down into Egypt. Chapter 13, verse 1 of Genesis, they come up out of Egypt, where he will live the remainder of his life, nomadic life in Canaan. He never built a house, but he was always building altars, a man of deep devotion whose offspring would bless the entire world. What do we always stop and remind ourselves of when we talk about Abraham's seed be a blessing to the whole world? The important thing about that is to acknowledge that seed is to be defined in the singular rather than in the plural sense. Abraham's seed will bless the whole world through the person of one descendant, Jesus. And this is the argument that Paul makes in Galatians chapter 3. And every opportunity I get, I highlight this because so many people think that the promise was that all of Abraham's descendants, otherwise the nation of the Jews, would bless the whole world. And that was never the promise. The promise was only that through Abraham's family, the Jewish people, that one would come who would bring blessings to the whole world. And so Paul says, not as of seed or offspring, meaning many, but as of one, namely Jesus Christ, Galatians 3:16 through 19. So the whole purpose of Abraham's story as it's recounted in Egypt, and why we deal with it in terms of where he was, where he moved to, why he ultimately came back to Canaan and lived the nomadic life. God picked him to be the father of the Jewish nation, out of which his son Jesus would come into the world. And the Old Testament story is how God brought this all about. And one of the things that we have noted frequently is that it often looked as though God's plan was going to fail. But there was always a means or a way to keep the promise or hope alive until ultimately Jesus came on the scene. And of course, one of the arguments that is then made by Paul in his Galatian epistle and elsewhere is that with the arrival of Jesus, the law, which kept the Jews distinct and separate, has served its purpose. It has now been nailed to the cross and taken away, and we're all under a different dispensation and a different set of rules, the New Testament. But that was God's plan from the beginning. Now, when he came back from Egypt, he lived a nomadic life in Palestine. It's here that we encounter the story that's so familiar about Abraham and Sarah being barren, and yet the promise of God rings loudly in both their ears. You're going to be the father of a great nation, and he has no offspring. Sarah seeks to help God out by providing a substitute, Hagar, who is an Egyptian. And Abraham and Hagar, in turn, have a son, Ishmael. And guess who all the Arab world looks to as their father Abraham through the son Ishmael. And they have no regard for Isaac and his descendants, the Jewish people. At the time when Sarah ultimately weans Isaac, Ishmael is seen taunting or making fun of Sarah's son. And that's the last straw. Sarah insists that Hagar and Ishmael have to go. And so Abraham reluctantly sent them away. There's no doubt in my mind as I read the story that Abraham loved both Hagar and her son Ishmael. But he loved Sarah more and had to respect her wish. And so Hagar, the Egyptian, and her son Ishmael, who is part Jewish and part Egyptian, will ultimately become the father of the Arab world, as Abraham through Isaac is the father of the Jewish world. And this great hatred that developed continues to the present, and the things that we're seeing played out over in that part of the world, and the attitude that the Arab world has toward Israel, and sadly Israel toward the Arab world, is deeply rooted in this very history, this story. By the way, I might point out to you that one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, found this story to be among the most admired stories in the Old Testament from his perspective. And it's thought that that might possibly explain the relationship that it appears he had with a certain slave girl that had a number of children who had a lot of characteristics of Thomas Jefferson. Though they were never married, she did spend time with him in France when he was there. There are times when they were apart and there are no children born, and it seems like when they're both in the same vicinity, inevitably 9 months later she's bearing a child. I don't think, from my perspective, from what I've read, and I just finished a book on that particular story, that there's much doubt in my mind that he had a relationship. His wife died at an early age, and he never remarried, but he had a relationship with one of his slaves. Indefensible, but he would argue, I suspect, that he was only doing what Sarah allowed Abraham to do with Hagar. Just for your consideration, it has nothing to do with biblical geography. Joseph was taken into Egypt, as you know. Genesis 37 begins with the story of Joseph's dream. He dreams, and the interpretation of the dream was quite obvious to the whole family. You're all going to bow down before me, including my dad. And that outraged his brothers, leading them ultimately, when he is sent to see how they're doing with the flocks, they in turn sell him to a caravan. The caravan takes him to Egypt, where he is sold to Potiphar and will remain for 22 years in Egypt apart from his family. During that time, he goes from being a slave to the head of Potiphar's household, to being in jail, and ultimately becoming the second most powerful man in the nation. And all of this providentially brought about the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. You're going to be the father of a great nation, but before this happens, your descendants are going to spend 400 years in bondage. Abraham never knew where that would be, and obviously never lived to see it happen. But this is how God brought that about. Joseph goes to Egypt, having been sold into slavery by his brothers, ultimately comes to a position of great power, and in that position is able to deliver his own family from what could have easily been certain death through famine. And when he is confronted by his brothers, he makes known his identity. They immediately assume he is going to seek vengeance. Chapter 45, he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. In other words, I realize your motivation wasn't good, but I also recognize the hand of God in all of this. I'm not going to take your lives, though he easily could have. Not going to do it because I see the hand of God in all of this. And what appears to be very bad, God brought much good from. And when Jacob died, they took their dad back to Canaan as they promised to bury him. And in chapter 50, they immediately think now that dad is dead, Joseph will get his revenge. And a second time, he asserts, no, you may have meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, as it is this day to bring about the salvation of much people. So that's one of the best examples of the providence of God at work that I know of in Scripture, and it's a wonderful illustration of Romans 8:28 in my judgment. But this is how ultimately they get down in Egypt, where they will become this great nation. Jacob sent his sons to buy grain, and it's through this process, because you all know the story, we won't go into it, that they are reunited. And ultimately, the family moves to Egypt at the insistence of Pharaoh. And they are given one of the best areas geographically. The land of Goshen is in the Nile Delta. It's extremely fertile. Obviously, the Nile provides an abundant source of water, and they thrived. They grew to such an extent that it was perceived that they were a threat. Do you see anything in that might have a modern application? What can happen when you get people coming into a nation? They can do one of two things. They can assimilate, which is what has happened throughout our history, though there are clearly, regions in major cities that are populated by the Irish and the German and things like that. Columbus has German village, although, clearly that's an assimilation. But right now we're seeing people coming, especially from the Middle East, who are not assimilating. The Somalis are quite prominent in Dearborn, Michigan, and other areas, and they've tended to want to keep their own culture and their own ways, and have not, at least yet, made the effort to assimilate. Well, Israel came into Egypt, but there was no assimilation. And there could not be, because they had to stay their own special people, because God was going to use them. Remember, He called them not for privilege, but for purpose, to be the mechanism through which He would bring His Son into the world, who would bless the entire world. So they're brought down into Egypt, where they will be for 400 years, going from 75, as I said, to possibly more than 3 million. 400 years in Egyptian bondage, and then God raised up Moses. And you see the providence at work again. You look at Exodus chapter 1. The command was that all of the Egyptian boys are to be killed at birth, but the midwife said that when they were called on the carpet, why the Jewish women are so much stronger than the Egyptian women that by the time we get there, the kids are already born. So the decree is they're just, the male children are to die, and Moses' parents put him in the basket on the river, hidden among the cattails, we would say, the bulrushes, and he was found by Pharaoh's daughter, and thus raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, which meant ultimately that he was exposed to the very best education available, would have had the finest food and clothing and housing of his day. And yet, who was his nurse but his own mother? What did she instill from him? Obviously, from an early age, his true roots. And when he had to make a choice between everything Egypt offered or make the sacrifice to remain faithful to his God and his people. He chose to follow God rather than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season, and ultimately would lead his people out of bondage. There was the time when he slew the Egyptian for abusing a fellow Israelite. That led ultimately to his fleeing to Midian, where he lived for 40 years. The first 40 in Egypt, the next 40 in Midian, and then at the age of 80, God called him to go back to Egypt to stand before Pharaoh and demand, "Let my people go," and that's where the plagues come, and ultimately the Exodus and the story of the wilderness wanderings. There's continued interaction between Israel and Egypt throughout the Old Testament period. I wanted to highlight a couple of examples here. Isaiah 36, actually 36 through 38, tells of an event in the days of Hezekiah when the Assyrian army, which has conquered Israel to the north, is at the very gates of Jerusalem. And a representative of Assyria, a Rabshakeh, stands on the other side of the walls looking up and telling everyone on the wall, "Don't listen to Hezekiah. He will tell you that your God will deliver you, or that the Egyptians will come to your rescue. But anybody who trusts in Egypt is like taking a staff in his hands that has a sharp point and it goes through the hand. Egypt will not help you, they will only hurt you." And ultimately what happened in this story is that there was a rumor that the nation of Assyria faced a threat at home, and so Sennacherib abandoned Jerusalem, went back home, where he was ultimately slain by his own sons. And Esarhaddon then came to the throne of Assyria, and the Assyrian Empire will soon fall to the Babylonians. But that's an example down history where Egypt comes into play. And the second example here is in 2 Chronicles chapter 35. I think the narrative begins about 20 and goes through the end of the chapter. This is in the days of Josiah, king of Judah. Josiah was one of the really good kings, by the way, of the southern kingdom. And Pharaoh Necho of Egypt is rushing toward Carchemish to encounter the forces of Babylon under the leadership of Nabopolassar, when Josiah musters the army of Judah and meets Pharaoh Necho's army on the plains of Megiddo. This is where we get Armageddon in Revelation, and the Battle of Armageddon. It was an area where many major battles were fought. And Pharaoh Necho of Egypt says, "I don't have a problem with you. There is no need for us to fight." But for reasons that are not explained in Scripture, Josiah is unwilling to back off. He disguises himself, much like Ahab did when he went into battle with Jehoshaphat against Syria. He disguises himself and is in the midst of the battle struck, taken back to Jerusalem, and dies and is buried. Some historians think that Josiah and the kingdom of Judah may have had some kind of alliance at this point with Babylon that compelled Josiah to offer some resistance. Necho's army, the Egyptians, were headed to Carchemish up on in the Mesopotamian area. But these are the two encounters that stand out when you talk about Egypt and its connection with Israel in the Old Testament. Then you get to the New Testament, and what do you have? You have the flight of Joseph and Mary down into Egypt, because they have been warned that Herod seeks the life of their son. When they learn in Egypt that Herod is dead, they determine to come back home. But when it's discovered that Archelaus, his son, reigns in his stead, rather than settling in Bethlehem, they go north into Galilee and settle in Nazareth, so that the argument is that he might be a Nazarene, as the prophets had predicted, a resident of Nazareth. So though he's born in Jerusalem and his family was originally from Bethlehem, Bethlehem of Judah. He ends up being raised in Galilee, in Nazareth. And the argument is made, well, no prophet ever came out of Nazareth, so he can't be a prophet of God. But even that argument was false because Jonah was actually from Galilee. So that was a false argument. But this is the New Testament encounter with Egypt. Now let's look very quickly at more recent history. I don't know if this shows up very well or not. Oh, it shows up okay. You probably have heard of the Six-Day War in 1967. This was Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq against Israel. The War of Attrition, 1967 to 70, against Israel, led by Egypt, the Soviet Union, the Palestinian Liberation Army, and Jordan. And then the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Algeria, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Cuba. Now, I'm old enough to remember these, but I suspect a lot of younger people are not terribly familiar with the wars just in my lifetime that the Arab nations have launched against Israel. Without success, I hasten to add. What are the explanations for their failure and Israel's success in rebuffing all these efforts? Our premillennial friends would argue that God is protecting Israel because Israel's existence is vital to the fulfillment of prophecy regarding the establishment of the kingdom and the millennial reign of Jesus. I would submit to you that they have a better trained and better equipped force who are fighting on their homeland against invading forces, and the advantage is always to those who are on their homeland in terms of defeating the enemy, unless there are overwhelming odds against them. Israel has stood tall through all of these efforts, and these are just examples. Now, in relationship to Israel and Egypt today, they share a common border. Let me point that out to you right through there. This was all captured by Israel in one of those previous wars, but ultimately returned as a result of a treaty to Egypt. And this is the Sinai Peninsula. Mount Sinai was in that area, and that's all under the control of Egypt today. Egypt is the only modern country which incorporates within its territory 2 continents. This is Africa, and this is considered Asia, and this is the line of demarcation, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Suez Canal. The only nation that encompasses 2 continents in landmass in this fashion. Now somebody will say, well, what about the U.S. and the state of Hawaii? We're not talking about islands. We're talking about general landmass as it comes together here. That's Africa to the east and Asia to the west. Or pardon me, just the opposite, Africa to the west and Asia to the east. Okay. Israel and Egypt have had a pretty shaky relationship, but the good news is, at least for Israel, Egypt was the first to really recognize them, the first Arab state. They actually had a treaty and had reasonably good relations until relatively recently. Egypt is probably best known today for the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded about 1920-something. I think it was 23, but I'm afraid to say that because somebody will Google it and tell me I'm wrong. So it was in the 1920s. They emphasized 2 things. A very conservative approach to the Quran and Sharia law, and they've made a name for themselves not just in Egypt but around the Arab world for their charity work. They're currently labeled as a terrorist organization even within Egypt, though recently when Hosni Mubarak was overthrown, Morsi was elected, and Morsi was affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that created some real problems even for the United States in terms of how do you address someone who has been elected to office but holds a position that is in opposition to most of the positions we hold as a nation. He was duly elected. He got the votes, but it didn't make folks here in the States very happy. Sadly, this has happened in the past. We began a few weeks ago with what happened with Iran. Do you remember 1952? They had a duly elected ruler, and the CIA doesn't like him because he has Marxist leanings. So our CIA comes in and encourages a coup which overthrows the duly elected leader of Iran and installs in his place the Shah, who was a very close ally of America, but not very popular with his own people, leading to the revolt in the 1970s, 1979, in fact, when the hostages were taken and the Shah was forced to leave, and the Ayatollah came to power. And we have been reaping the fruits of all of that ever since. And I'm certainly not a defender of Iran, but I understand why they might look at us as the great Satan. How would you feel if the Russian KGB managed to come in and instigate a coup and overthrow our duly elected officials? And there's some of them I might not want to stay in office personally, but I want them voted out, not thrown out, or impeached, not thrown out by some military power. I wouldn't be happy with that. And neither were they. And we're still reaping the fruits of those events back in 1979, which was the result of events in 1952. And it really is all connected. John is about ready to hit the buzzer. I don't know if I've got time to get through this slide or not. Shooting down of the Russian plane occurred, I don't know if it was earlier this year or late last year. I think it was earlier this year. But now, Russia and Egypt seem to be buddying up. Putin's trying to get his hands in a whole lot of things. And there was a recent coup attempt in Egypt. That's just this summer. And Morsi, who is the present leader of Egypt, has really clamped down. He has eliminated literally thousands of public servants and generals and high-ranking officials in his own government. He believes were part of the coup attempt. And when I say eliminate, he's taken them out of their offices and instilled his own men. So things are kind of in a mess in Egypt right now. We've had pretty close ties, but how long that's going to remain, I have no way of predicting. When we pick up our study next week, we're going to look at the relationship which exists between Egypt and Israel at the present. My goal is for you to have a better understanding of geography and a better understanding of why things are in such a mess over there and why their messes keep impacting us. Bill sent me an email this past week that lists what has happened in history since the advent of Islam in the 7th century BC to the present. And there's just this litany of attacks on free peoples everywhere, including our own nation. And honestly, behind it all are two things. Number one, the belief that Islam was meant by God to rule the world. And number two is the idea that everybody has to therefore be under Sharia law. And it's either accept it or be killed. There is no middle ground with fundamentalists within Islam. And frankly, most Muslims are very fundamental. They really do advocate for Sharia law and for the world to come under the thumb of Allah. and they do anything they can to accomplish that. Not so much by means of persuasion, but by the sword. I got to quit, John.